don't know what New York weather's been like, but it was 80 degrees in Denver the last couple of days, and so kids coming home, going for a walk around the block has been nice, and haven't been able to do that for 4 months.
Yeah, man, I'm with you. Like in New York, it's been 80 degrees. I'm like walking around right now with shorts on. It's unbelievable. And with that, when we're talking about the heat, we're going to dive right into the heat with Eddie. Welcome, everyone. We are live, Eddie. And so, yeah, we are here with Eddie Santillan. He's the VP of Customer Experience at Sparrow. And I'm super pumped to have him on the show today. As always, I'm Nick Freund, the founder of Workstream.io. And we're going to dive into CX teams, how CX teams use data, kind of all of these interesting intersections between operational teams and data and the data they leverage and how it can empower various parts of the business. So anyways, Eddie, as always, I'd love for you maybe to just kick us off today. Tell us about your background. Tell us about Sparrow. Anything that you think might be interesting to the audience or relevant to this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And first of all, thank you for having me. Really excited to be here and chat a little bit about data and customer experience. Yeah, a little background on myself, Eddie Santillan, currently at Sparrow, which is a leave management provider in the US. We help employees and employers and help folks navigate these really vulnerable moments of leave throughout the process. Background prior to Sparrow is in operations and technology. Started my career in what I would consider traditional manufacturing and operations. It was a asphalt-based roofing manufacturing plant, and so really cut my teeth in operations there, and was lucky enough to find my way into technology and operations, which was a world I didn't know about before I entered it. And that started really at Google with their book search operation, which their mission is to scan and digitize all the world's books. And so that was really unique and really opened my eyes to technology and operations and the impact that can have. After that, spent about 8 years at Gusto. I joined them when they were about 70 folks, known as Zen Payroll. Tons of fun
Amazing.
scaling operational challenges. And then now I'm at Sparrow at a similar size, about 100 folks, and really excited to be there.
That's awesome. So I learned two things from that. One, about your pre-Google background, which I'd actually never heard you talk about. And two, that despite the fact that I've known you for over 10 years, I'm still mispronouncing your last name technically. So I need to take that back to the humble pie factory and work on that one.
That's all right.
But yeah, man, it's such a super interesting background, like from operation, like true kind of internal operations to customer experience. I guess on the latter, piece, customer experience specifically, which you've been working now on for a long time, like how would you like describe the contours of customer experience? I was talking with Shri, who we both know from Ramp, about growth and like what growth could mean.
Yeah.
And I don't think customer experience is as squishy a term as growth, but I don't know, it could just mean so many different things depending upon like what the business does. I'd just be curious, like how you think about the boundaries of it. How would you describe customer experience both at Sparrow as well as more broadly?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the broad one because I think it's boundaries is a super interesting word, Nick, because I think in a lot of ways, I think of it as without boundaries. And I think when folks say customer experience, they think of the service component of customer experience. But I'm a believer that it's really the entire journey. And I think that actually probably starts at go-to-market or brand awareness to someone's buying journey, onboarding, if that exists in a journey, to then their lifetime on a platform or a service. And that touches basically every single team within a company. And the way I would define customer experience is really that holistic journey. And it's the makeup of all those small interactions that really shapes the perceptions of someone's experience with a brand. And of course, if someone's been with a brand for many years, those early day buying journeys are a small piece of it. And the more recent interactions become more meaningful in how somebody feels with a brand. But I'd push the thought a little bit that it's actually throughout that entire journey, not just the service component that makes up someone's customer experience. And then the other
Yeah, I
thing I
mean,
would,
to simplify that and to kind of put words in your, it's kind of
yeah,
like the sum of all of the experiences that someone might have
100,
had with you, your company, your product, your brand, right?
100%. You got it.
That's all I had. Continue.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other piece I think is there's this really unique intersection, Nick, of product and service or software and service. And so when you look at something like an NPS score, what generally most folks will say is your promoters and your detractors. So the folks who are the most loyal and maybe those who are having the most friction at the moment. The number one and the number two things I've seen are always product and service. And so really that sweet spot of where you can find that intersection of where is software best or where is a person the best or service the best is really an interesting space to play, and data plays a really big part of that, as you can imagine.
Totally. Super fascinating and interesting. Like, again, when I kind of think about your background and experiences, there's this like deep operations background and then customer experience, which has been a lot about managing these like large teams,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I don't know how big the team is at Sparrow today, but I mean, at Google, like when you were managing, was it ebooks technically? Like,
Yeah.
how big was the scanning center or operations center that you were responsible for by like the end of your time there? And this was like, you were how old? You were like 25, 26 at this time?
Yeah, about then.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a few different roles. I think at the end, I was more in like a central quality team that was doing interesting things
Mhm.
around you needed a person to help with the algorithms. And I'll give a really fun example
Yeah.
where when you launch Google Maps in a new state, you can imagine people from or new country rather. There's different laws, license plates looks different, people's skin tone may look different, and so the algorithm is not good at blurring those things out. And so you need to teach the algorithm. And so we had for every product, we had an organization of about 500 folks that were helping across the entire suite of products.
Mm.
Books happened to be one of the big pieces of it. And so that's the size. I would just share, I think that was an evolution. The
Yeah.
first role in the operation world was about 25, 30 folks. And transparently made every single mistake in the book. No one comes out of the womb knowing how to lead folks, and I thought that was a really good humbling experience in a
Yeah.
manufacturing plant that really helped enable the future.
Totally. But I mean, just so folks have a sense of scale, I mean, you've sat over organizations of like hundreds of people, correct? With like multiple layers of management underneath you. And I appreciate, the humble aspect of your personality and that it has grown and evolved over time,
Sure.
right? But
Yes.
we're talking about like large manpower intensive organizations.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Cool. Again, I probably should have said person power. Is there? I don't know if there's a better word for that in today's day and age. So I need to work on that in addition to pronouncing one of my friends' last names right. When you kind of think about that, like these larger teams, these larger organizations, right? What do you think are like the unique challenges of it? You talked to some about making mistakes
Mhm.
in the beginning. But do you think there are unique things that you need to know as a leader as you get to that scale? Do you have a specific management philosophy that you think applies to these types of teams or roles that's helpful?
Yeah. I love the question, Nick. So I think a few things that I think one I'll say is I think unique to a quickly scaling company is it's about mindset is one thing that I just believe for both myself and frankly everyone. And I think you just have to be eyes wide open that there's always going to be change and there's always going to be meaningful change. There's going to be challenges, there'll be new fires, there'll be opportunities, there'll be wins. But I think just kind of knowing that there's going to be highs and lows at a quickly growing company is just, and having that awareness is kind of half the battle and knowing that it's going to come. And part of that is because things are growing so quickly. If things were not growing so quickly, you wouldn't have those things and you might miss them. And so I think the way I've best heard it described as being in a driver mindset. You can be a driver around both yourself or your team or whatever it happens to be. Um, and so that's one piece of it. And I think I'll give a really clear example. And this is true at any growing company. You could view and look around the room and be like, there's problems everywhere. I choose to say that and how I think is that there's opportunities everywhere. And maybe that's become a bit of an optimist or a glass half full type person, but those are all opportunities for us to make things better. And I love to say that if we're still doing the same things 6 and 12 months from now, we probably would have all failed at our jobs because we're growing so quickly and we have to evolve how we do things to scale differently. So, growth mindset or driver mindset, I'd say, is the first one. The other ones, from like a management philosophy perspective, I don't think are unique, but I'll say them anyways because I think they're important. I'm a big believer in servant leadership, and to put that like in plain terms, like I feel like I work for my team, not the other way around, and I think that's likely where a lot of folks get it wrong over time. But I work for my team, and so I'll just say that again. And then the other one is just around like trust and transparency. And so I'm a big believer in oversharing information, not sharing, not looking at everything through rose colored glass and all that stuff. And so I'm a big believer in the best ideas come from the people who are talking to our customers every single day. And that comes from manufacturing world at the asphalt based plant, seeing people who have been working on the same production line for 20 years. They have the ideas. How do we help somebody and push them to get those ideas and share them and share best practices across other plants, other operations, other pods, whatever it happens to be? And so I think building that trust and accountability is just a big piece of it too.
For sure. And anyone, by the way, who might be joining, we're talking with Eddie from Sparrow, who runs customer experience there, about data and customer experience teams and operations teams. And the thing you just shared, I mean, I just love that so much, right? That as a leader, you serve your team. It's not the other way around. Fun tidbit, I was talking with a very, very successful venture capital investor who's invested in multiple like unicorn, multi-billion dollar companies, publicly traded companies that are worth like tens of billions of dollars, like from all the way very beginning. And not a current investor in our company, but I was like joking with him about how he gave me a hard time when he sits on our board, and he immediately turned it around to me and looked at me very seriously. Like, I don't sit on boards. I serve on boards. I serve the company. And it's the exact same thing that you're talking about. And that's a really important mindset, I think, all the way up and down an organization, but probably the most important at the top. And I think it yields what you're talking about, right? That the best ideas are coming from these folks on the front line. So like, how are you empowering them to do more, or identifying those things and helping them achieve them? I mean, so maybe with that, we can change gears like a little bit to talk about like data and operations in general. Do you think kind of the nature of these, again, large, intensive, like teams with regards to human capital and people, like, do you think there's something unique to them about how they use data, or they should be using data?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. So I think yes and no. I think for service heavy organizations, I think it's always an evolution. And I'll share a Google philosophy, Nick, that I don't fully buy into, but I think it's got some partial truth. It's they're more or less, I'll summarize it in that it's anytime someone at Google's their service arm, someone reaches out, a customer reaches out, they believe it's because it was a product failure somewhere earlier upstream. And that's kind of been their philosophy for a long, long time. That can lead to bad customer experiences where if you need help and it's hard to get to somebody, that's not ideal. And so that's kind of why I don't fully buy into it. But what I do buy into is I do think a lot of reasons for these large organizations can be because of a lack of customer confidence somewhere upstream that happened. And it can be because they didn't know how to complete an action. They needed some validation that they were doing the right thing. The company didn't give clear guidance on what the next steps were. And so there wasn't that visibility to whatever the workflow happens to be. And that's where I think data can be incredibly powerful to understand that entire sub journey. Because if you're just measuring when somebody emailed or called you or sent you a note, you're kind of only seeing the tail end of the funnel. And so I like to think about it as a funnel around, well, what happened before? What were they trying to do? What actions happened? What part of the product did they go through? What self-help do they maybe not go to? And then they're like, oh, all right, I need to talk to somebody to figure this next issue out. And so I think it's really important to measure that entire piece of it. And so that's one piece of it, I would say, that is important. And that can really drive product, customer education, knowledge. There's a whole virtuous cycle that can exist there.
It kind of, just to hop in quickly,
Yeah,
it kind of speaks to part of what you were saying about the boundaries of customer experience, right?
Yeah.
And measuring customer experience. And that's kind of measuring that journey that a customer is having, right? All the collective experiences that they've had that might have led to that end incident, excuse me, which you could look at the handle time on as an example, right? But what you're saying is, no, actually, we should be understanding this entire funnel, and that last piece is a piece of it, but it's not the entire thing. You really need to go all the way to the beginning to really understand it.
Yep, that's exactly right. Maybe the other piece I would share there too is around. I actually think there's a lot of folks may look at an interaction as not having value, and I'll just give something where, like, if someone is trying to reset their password, it's hard to see a lot of value created for anyone in the network. Like, the person just wants to log in, we're going to walk them through how to reset it, etc. Not a ton of value, but there are moments where I think a service organization can really lean in. Can we educate a customer? Are they maybe not using the product in the most effective way or getting the most ROI? And so I think that's where, if in an ideal world, you could build a product and a workflow that has confidence, but then you're able to lean in these moments that matter and really add value to the customer. That's where I think it's the golden goose in a lot of ways. And it'll be an evolution, because as you build new products and surface area expands, you'll kind of be at different stages of this. And so getting the data throughout the full funnel allows you to be less reactive and more proactive over time.
Totally. Well, I mean, I think there's an element of getting all of that data through the funnel, right? I mean, do you have a 360 view of your company? Which is, I just hate business buzzwords so much, but I use them all the time on the show. Like, oh, you have a 360 view of your customer and all of its data, right? And if you don't have that, you can't understand them. But I think the more important thing, which is kind of implied in what you were just saying, is that, like, that customer care person or that advocate, agent, whatever you want to call them, you got to empower that person with that data, so they've got it at that moment where they're, like, interacting with that person who's just trying to reset their password, right? And maybe you can turn that interaction into something that isn't just a piece of frustration, but could empower them or enable them or turn them around in some way.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, you got it exactly right. And I'll give, from a previous life, over time, you have a bunch of customer data. And in a lot of ways, you may see an issue with their account, like a setup issue or something else. And so they may have called about X, but you can use it as an opportunity to actually talk about Y, to help them avoid a future pothole in the road that is coming. And I think a lot of organizations collect a lot of really good data, but may not actually surface it, the way you're saying, in a meaningful way to the right person at the right time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so much goes into this. And so this question is not meant to be like, give me a list of systems, but in general, when you think about, like, that type of journey or funnel or collection of experiences, like, where are the places historically you've been trying to, like, pull data from to, like, expose it to your team? Like, of course, there's going to be data within your customer support software. But, like, what else to you is, like, the most important or relevant for leaders to be thinking about?
Yeah. So maybe to play that back, Nick, what's the most useful to talk about some vendors that maybe are sources?
Like, you don't have to be like Salesforce or whatever, right? But I would imagine you're talking about, like, product experience, right? So, like, you need to be collecting product data and serving that to like your frontline support people or service people. Like, what are the other categories like that you think are maybe, like, the top, right? Like, you could do everything, but what are the most important things if you got to focus on 3 of them or 4?
Totally. Yeah. So I'll go at the top of the funnel. yes, the product things. I think I'll share one like full story. I found like an interesting tool that can help you understand, and it records the life cycle, can help you understand pain points. If you've got a knowledge management system, being able to feed like that part of the journey, like what did they search for? Usually someone has tried. There's a lot of research out there that people actually prefer the self-service route. So what were their queries? What are their keywords? Where do they fail? That Seeing that piece of it can give you some clues into the journey before you kind of get on the phone with them, as it were.
That's
And
cool.
then
I like that, like the journey they might have had with your like help center. I hadn't thought
exactly.
about that.
Yep.
For
Yep.
super cool. Sorry, continue.
No, it's all good. And then the other piece of it is, if you can figure out what their issue is before they get to somebody, ideally you're getting them to the person who can solve it best. And if you have a really complex product, generally it's best to not have a generalist, but to have a specialist and someone who can help with that specific thing. So that's another piece of data, is figuring out like, okay, what's our best assumption based on all these pieces of
Mm-hmm.
information upstream. And then when you are talking, or when you're interacting with the individual, with someone on the service side, I think understanding some of their history is really important. If it's a B2B thing, let's understand their NPS scores historically, maybe some recent transactional customer satisfaction, maybe what tier customer they are. If you have a customer health score, that could be an interesting thing to surface in there. What some of the previous issues were, maybe something like that. But obviously, the more you have, the less useful it is. And so for each business, it's different. But pulling some of that historical information from the specific customer can help empower the person who's having the discussion, to ensure they're not wasting the time and having the right type of discussion with the individual.
Makes total sense. I mean, definitely that's a. I mean, there's of course, I'm sure there's more there, right? But like, if you've got a good handle on that, you're probably providing folks a lot more than most organizations do, especially if you can like route those requests to like the appropriate person, which is a little bit less about like presenting the agent
Sure.
or that person the data, and more using the data to ensure you get to the right person. But
Yep.
same like, or similar like type of desire there, right? For a
Yep.
better experience.
Yep.
So you've mentioned NPS score like a couple of times, and like obviously the way you think about usage of data goes much more beyond like, here are the most important metrics, right? Or like, we're going to measure like the success of our support organization by handle time, as an example. But I would imagine you track stuff like this as well. Like are there key metrics that you think are like important? You mentioned NPS. Are there others like them that you go to quite a bit? And if so, like, are there drawbacks to just like to any of them, or that approach in general?
Yeah. Yes, there are probably pros and cons to all of them. NPS, I think, is a good North Star type metric for a company. And I'll kind of go back to like, it's generally always a combination of product and service, usually, on both ends of the spectrum. And so I think it can be a nice holistic view of how a customer feels about the company, brand, et cetera. I think the interesting thing with NPS, which I talked about at Sparrow a few weeks ago too, is like, it's a nice like North Star metric. And I'm using the term intentionally because where we're at an evolution, and where a lot of companies are at, is they'll measure it, but they may not directly tie it to a business outcome. And without doing that, it's a little hard to really action it. And I'll share something that a former boss used to say a lot, which was like, I can juice our NPS tomorrow, and I'll just give away our product for free. And that's true. You probably have a lot more happy promoters in the system. It may not be the right business decision to give your product away for free to get more promoters in the system. And so tying it to lifetime value, churn, cost to serve, like, I think mapping that is incredibly important. But NPS, back to that one, quality metric, I think important. I think understanding, and I'll start high, just like the unit economics of any business is really important. And you can blend it all together, but usually it's better to segment it by different customer types or personas that you might have, and understanding why those differences exist. And so that's really like at the highest level. And then kind of getting down to like the core CX type metrics, is there are more transactional surveys that can exist, because a journey can last a long time. In Sparrow's world, like a leave, like I'll just use like a birthing caregiver leave, might last 6 months on average in the system. And so that's the entire journey. And we care about how did it go end to end for somebody who's on our platform. But there's also a lot of sub journeys within. And so being able to measure those and understand why they happen and what the sentiment is across is really powerful to then drive improvements and product operational improvements kind of everywhere in between. And so there's a whole bunch of metrics and KPIs that you can measure those sub journeys in, and that can be how quickly are we responding, SLA performance, first contact resolution, how long things, all those things, what the satisfaction was by the category. And so those are more traditional, I would say, but are just really important to understand the journey.
Totally. And I can imagine, like, as you think about each one of those sub journeys, right? If you think about, I think it was a birthing, like parent leave was the example you used, like over the course of that 6 months or whatever that person is given, there's got to be a lot of interactions. But you probably could bucket a lot of those sub journeys or interactions into like the specific thing that person might be doing or going through. And you probably can pull on that thread for that individual, or pull on that thread for all of the individuals that might have had that specific sub journey and measure it. And I think, to your point, what's really interesting there is like not only measuring it, but then connecting it to like the outcome that the customer had, right? And what that yielded.
Exactly.
I get to see that being so much more powerful in understanding what's going on, helping like serve your team to do that better, right? And then ultimately like evolve your business as you're talking, right? If it's growing fast, and it's kind of in this constant state of change.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you didn't say this, but there's also an interesting thread there, which we haven't talked about too. It's like data is like step one, but then what are you doing with it? And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to, is like what actions might it drive? And there's even a second point in there around, if I go down this example of a birthing caregiver, like the experience may be different in California than in New York or Texas. And so even understanding that nuance and being able to slice it may actually drive different actions depending on the characteristics of the interaction or the user journey or whatever it happens to be.
So, I mean, you're 100% speaking my language, like more broadly, when you're saying that like data is amazing, right? But that's only like the first step, and it's all about what you do afterwards. Like if you looked at my LinkedIn profile, like the cover, and it says data rocks, but knowledge rules, right? And I think it speaks to that ethos. It's like, what's the knowledge that gets created out of it? What does the business then go ahead and do with it? And that I think that tells you, like, does the data make that impact, right? And drive that customer outcome or that business outcome that you're talking about.
Yep.
So again, within your teams, within these organizations, oftentimes you have managed some type of hierarchy, right? Or served, maybe in your terms, like a larger hierarchy. I gotta continue to work on myself, Eddie. I learn this every time I talk to you. So like when you kind of think about these dynamics about data, where do you think data becomes the most impactful? Obviously, you find it impactful. Is it impactful all the way to the front line, like from the front lines to middle management to the executives? Like, you see it impactful across the board? And if so, like, are there areas that you would focus on first, or think that there's maybe like the most leverage for the team or the business?
Yeah. I think, yes, it's important everywhere. I think likely Sparrow's at a unique time because we're pretty small. And so I think as company grows, likely the granularity of it becomes less important the more you're on the senior executive side. And the details matter more the closer you get to the customer, but they're all important. The reason I share the difference in the company size is because today it's pretty flat. Like everyone has access everywhere because of the size. I think that'll evolve. And so maybe my key thing I would mention is what's really important to keep in mind is that all of it's aligned? Like, are you driving the same things? And is it aligned from what the company goals are to what we're trying to do in the year or the multi-year arc to the quarter to the month? And then how does that then drive to like the organization or team or individual goals? And I think really being thoughtful about the alignment of those things is important. And then also for anywhere in the system, like what are the incentives that are being created inherently when you have more or less a scoreboard? What incentives are you creating? And so you mentioned a metric of average handle time. I think that is like a very standard, for sure, a metric that exists everywhere in the world. It's really how long did something take? And when you're forecasting or trying to understand need, it's a really, really important metric to understand, because if you don't know how long something took, it's hard to figure out what you're going to need in the future to meet the customer needs. But I think like a very old school traditional thought process is to use handle time as a customer representative type metric. And my philosophy is a little bit different, is I think it's useful in forecasting and understanding need. I think using handle time as a driver for or a performance metric is probably not the right metric. It probably doesn't drive the right incentives if you care about quality. If all you care about is speed and efficiency, sure. But I would argue most modern CX organizations are putting a lot more emphasis on customer satisfaction, transactional NPS. Do you want to have 8-hour phone calls with every single customer? Probably not scalable, but those are good coaching opportunities, or understanding, well, why did that happen? And what was the root cause with the customer, et cetera? And so I think it's just really representative, Nick, of how the same metric can be used very differently in organizations and then can drive inherently just different behaviors. And so I think it's really important to be thoughtful around what incentive structure you're inherently creating with any sort of data in the system.
Totally. I mean, you could be to your point, you could be myopic across the board about, hey, we want to get handles times down because we have a problem with our, I don't know, unit economics as an example, right? And we're in this unique macroeconomic moment. So I can imagine there are teams that are focused on stuff like that. But that could completely erode customer trust, right? Or like
Exactly.
quality. And so like, what are you actually trying to accomplish? So be careful.
Yeah, 100%.
So I know that Sparrow itself, I mean, I would characterize it as a high growth company, but it's on the earlier part of the hockey stick, right? So I think you're going to, from our conversations, I know you're going to start to see a lot of what I'm about to ask you kind of in the upcoming kind of innings of your journey. But as you think about your career, all the organizations that you've served in the past, when it comes to analyzing data, consuming data, what are the core tools that you've used in the past and that you think are common within CX organizations?
Yeah, it's definitely an evolution. And maybe I'll the tooling, but then also I'll pivot a little, Nick, with the data too that comes out of those. And gosh, it's embarrassing is not the right word, but the reality is the earlier you are, the less structured this is. And spreadsheets are not uncommon. That was true at many early stage ventures that I've been a part of, where it's just that's the way in which you need to export data from some of your tooling, manipulate it in some way that's usable. It's not the most scalable, probably requires a person to continually update this daily, weekly, whatever the cadence happens to be. So that's generally how it all starts. I think now it's in Sheets versus Google Sheets versus Excel, but kind of the same thing.
I agree with you that it's not ideal. I think there is a pragmatic reality of that, regardless of your size. Sure. But you got to be very careful about how you do that and when you do that. And there are other options, but as an example, the one-off thing that we're just trying to understand. Often it's just the most obvious thing to do.
Exactly. And then there's an evolution where some of the out-of-the-box things from your providers that a CX team might use is good enough. And you can think about, I've used Desk.com, Zendesk, Salesforce. They all have reasonably robust out-of-the-box reporting. And that's for a middle stage where it's probably good enough, but won't take you to the next stage without more custom reporting. And then eventually, you've got your set of vendors, maybe a ticketing system, maybe a telephony provider, NPS like Typeform or something in the network, and then you have to marry all that data in some way. And so then the next phase is generally at some point you may get like a data eng team, and then you have it in a data warehouse, and you potentially visualizing it in Looker or Tableau or one of the many providers there, and that's where things become even more standardized, and documenting what things mean becomes even more important. And so I think that's the rough evolution I've seen: spreadsheets, out of the box tools directly in the systems, to finally a more productionized version for a scaled organization to use and have a source of truth going forward.
For sure. And I mean, this is like a leading question because we've talked about this in the past, right? But like, even when you get to that end state,
Oh, totally.
you're not necessarily like leaving all of that behind, right? I mean, you
No.
still, I mean, I agree with you that there is the role for the, the data supported, validated, backed and maintained, like set of reports in Looker or whatever your BI tool is.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of juju and value in these other solutions for other use cases. And you've seen that, right?
100%. And I think even if you think about prioritization too, for those type of things, like it becomes a slower moving action to get your BI tool updated and your source of truth. And so in these quickly growing companies, you're experimenting, doing new things, having new workflows that aren't piped in or mapped directly in the perfect way to visualize it. And then you kind of go backwards, where you're kind of like, okay, I need to go to the out of the box solution or SQL or spreadsheet, whatever it happens to be, to validate what I need, and then get it in the roadmap to be in your BI tool. So 100% that it doesn't become the silver bullet, because there's an evolution of your scale and your operation and your product that you need to continue to evolve with.
For sure. I mean, it's kind of like prototyping new initiatives or workflows and all of that, right? And you probably don't want to build a lot of infrastructure when you're prototyping or piloting something.
That's right.
So super interesting. Well, we're getting definitely over on time because so I should start to wrap this up at some point here. One or two more questions, and then
Sure.
I'll let you go about your merry day. When you've talked about these tools, and not only the importance of the tools, right, but then like the importance to like all layers of the organization. Like, how do you think about like enablement of your data across like the organization? Is it something that you've historically like had initiatives around, or like your teams have thought and put programs into?
Yeah, it's an interesting puzzle, Nick, and it's I know from our time at Gusto, starting to work with Workstream, and I think what's interesting at these quickly growing companies is there's also just a lot of new people, both people who may understand the industry or new to the space and the company, and there's a big learning curve inherently when you're growing quickly, and understanding what the data means, what actions it can drive, is an interesting puzzle that I will transparently say I don't know that I've seen figured out perfectly. And I'll just share, like, we rolled out an internal tool here, and like the non-scalable thing is like, okay, let's get in front of every person, walk them through it. That doesn't really work for when we hire 10 people next month and we're kind of in the same spot with 10 people who don't know how to utilize the tool. And so there's an aspect of learning and development, there's an aspect of documentation, and I don't know that I've transparently, Nick, figured out the silver bullet for how you scale that, but I think it's an interesting puzzle. And as you can imagine, part of one of the value props that I saw and our team saw on Workstream at Gusto, et cetera.
For sure. And I think one of the things that the threads that you were just pulling on there that I think interesting, and I'll try to connect it to something you said earlier, when you think about your data, right, or your reporting, or the stuff that we know is so important for all of these reasons, and if you're trying to enable your team on that, right, what's the sum of all the collective experiences they might have with it,
Mhm.
And then what's the sum of all the collective support experiences you need to provide to them so that they can best use it, right? And the analogy isn't perfect, but I think when you look at it in that way, it speaks to why it's such a complicated problem to solve, especially when you're constantly iterating and growing and experimenting, because it's like a moving target. Um, um, so with that, like we've been doing this for 40 minutes, and I really appreciate your time, Eddie. Before we go, are there any like parting thoughts for anyone who might be watching this about CX, serving large teams with data, how to think about CX and data, kind of anything that we might have gotten close to but not have touched on directly?
Yeah. Maybe it'll be a little bit of a tangent from data. And I think data is incredibly useful. I think nothing replaces talking to customers. So anyone who's listening who's on the CX world, like every time you talk to a customer, you will learn something. And not just the CX team. Even more importantly, if you're not on the CX team, talk to customers. And it just helps add some color to the data, give some nice qualitative edges, and you'll learn a whole bunch, that you may not pick up in a verbatim in a CSAT or an NPS reply that you get. And so that would just be my push for everyone is yes, data incredibly important, useful, action it. Nothing will replace talking to customers. So get out there and talk to customers as much as you can. So those would be my parting words.
For sure. Well, I'll plus one that. And I agree, data is important, but get out there and talk to your customers, regardless of where you sit within the organization. And yeah, Eddie, thanks so much for joining. This has been super illuminating and enlightening for me. And I definitely know a lot more about your philosophies around CX. And I hope that everyone who's been listening feels the same way. So, Eddie, again, thanks so much. And thanks for everyone who tuned in today.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate you having me on.
Of course. See ya.